I've called today's talk Four Generals. The course and outcome of battles and wars is generally dependent upon the leaders, upon the generals, and their competence or lack of it. And today we're going to look at four generals, not because they were the most important or the best of those that were involved in the South African War, but because all four of them, directly and one indirectly, had an effect on the Battle of Spioenkop. My name is Ron Gold, and this is the seventh in the series of videos that we're making here at 3 Tree Hill Lodge. The first man we will look at is Commandant General Piet Joubert of the Boers. He was 68 years old at the time the war broke out, and frankly his best years were behind him. He'd come from rural stock, had been the great hero of the Battle of Joubert 18 years earlier, when the British were humiliated at the end of the so-called First Boer War. But in the intervening years, he had become more moderate, and in fact he turned to politics and had contested elections on 4 separate occasions against President Paul Kruger and his hardline nationalists. But Piet Joubert was defeated on all 4 of these occasions, but nonetheless he remained the Vice President of the Transvaal, responsible for military affairs. He had a very bad feeling about the possibility of another war with Britain, believing that it would destroy his people. And this negativity caused him to delay the ordering of artillery from the French firm Creusot until it was too late, and the Boers would be seriously undergunned, if I can use that term, right throughout the war. But despite his attempts to avoid war, the die was cast, and he would lead his forces down the Laing's Neck Pass into the Crown Colony of Natal, a gloomy and unhappy general. And frankly, the early Boer successes should have been far more decisive than they were, and it was the attitude of Piet Joubert that affected them, and affected them badly. But on the 24th of November, the day after the Battle of Willow Grange, he took a very bad fall from his horse. Tragically for Piet Joubert, he would never fully recover from that fall. But he was invalided back to Pretoria, and the door was opened for the emergence of Louis Botha, a young man who would make all the difference in the world to the Boer campaign. 3 days after the war officially began, more or less at the same time that Commandant Joubert was traveling into Natal, riding into Natal rather, the flotilla sailed from Southampton, and on board was General Sir Redvers Buetta, holder of the VC. Buetta was 60 years old at the time of the Battle of Spioenkop. He had come from wealth, being educated both at Harrow and Eton, purchased a commission in the King's Royal Rifles, and had served around the world, and in particular here in South Africa during the frontier wars. I believe his finest hour was the Zulu Wars, the Battle of Joubert, where he would be awarded a Victoria Cross in dramatic circumstances. The awarding of medals in those days could be very political. It was not in Bulla's case. He was richly deserving of that honor. But after the Zulu War, he essentially went back to the UK and fulfilled administrative functions. People accuse him of being not particularly intelligent. That's not correct. He redesigned the entire British military supply system, forming the Quartermaster's Division, which in the same format is still in existence today. But the reality was that he lived the high life. He put on a bit of weight. But that wasn't the problem, really. The problem was that he became the classic example of the Peter principle, that he was promoted into the ranks of the general officers, and this was above his level of comfort and competence. He was very aware of this, and when the war clouds began to gather, he in fact tried to secure for himself an administrative post in the UK, the Commander-in-Chief, but he failed in this and was general in charge of troops at Aldershot when the war broke out, and as such was dispatched to South Africa despite his having requested the Minister of War that someone else should take the command. Buetta was aware that his skills were not in politics. They were not as a tactician and a strategist. But nonetheless, he makes his way out to South Africa, and he had, before he left, issued an advisory to British soldiers in South Africa. And the advisory was, for those in Natal, do not place any troops north of the Tugela River. That area, says Bulla, is a salient. He was aware of how quickly Boers could move across the ground. But of course, his advisory was ignored. And when Bulla arrived here, he found himself in the position of having to undo the mess that General Simmons and White had got him into. The third of our generals is Louis Botha, 37 years old. Louis Botha, again, came from farming stock. He had had some military experience in the First War, the Transvaal War. He had led Dinizulu's volunteers at the age of 22. These were a group of Boers who were attempting to restore the Usuthu faction to the ruling class of Zululand. When the war loomed here in South Africa in 1899, he rejoined the Vryheid Commando as a common burger, a private soldier if you like. But that didn't last for long. He distinguished himself in the Battle of Ladysmith, and when the unfortunate Commandant Joubert took the fall from his horse, it was Louis Botha who initially, unofficially, stepped in as the de facto leader of the Boers in Natal. And this would make an enormous change to their fortunes. It was Louis Botha who designed the defences along the north bank of the Tugela River, opposite the railway bridge at Kalenzo. And he was a man who really did think outside the box. And when General Bulla launched his forces at the Boers at Kalenzo, they took a crushing defeat. And that was the day that Louis Botha's name was on everybody's lips. He'd become known. Sadly, it was also the day of the beginning of the slide for General Sir Redvers Bulla. For me, it's always been a tragedy that a 40-year exemplary career would be destroyed in a period of 6 weeks here in South Africa. Bulla will destroy it himself, his career, but nonetheless, there is a sadness. The last of our generals is Lieutenant General Sir Charles Warren. For those of you not familiar with the pecking order, a lieutenant general is one step down from a full general. So Warren would be junior to Bulla. Warren is a highly intelligent man. He had in fact attended both Sandhurst and Woolwich, passed out near the top of the class, and served his career in the army as a Royal Engineer. He was a surveyor, in fact, and made the first ever accurate measurements of the Rock of Gibraltar, astounding people many years later who never really understood how he could have been so accurate with the primitive instruments he had. He was involved in Jerusalem, providing an escort for British archaeologists. But he got involved in the research himself and became known as Jerusalem Warren, produced some papers which are still referred to today. However, like many British soldiers, Warren had never been in a battle. He'd been to South Africa once or twice on administrative duties, but when the war in South Africa broke out in 1899, he was in retirement. He penned a little note to the Commander-in-Chief suggesting that he believed there was a little show on in Africa, and if he could render some small service to Her Majesty, he would be delighted to be considered. To his amazement, he was given command of the 5th Division. But he said, "I've never seen 15,000 men in one place in my life." "Well," said Charles, "now you have." It is Warren then who brought the 5th Division into Natal in the early weeks of January 1900 to join with Bulla, increasing Bulla's force to 30,000. Bulla will move the bulk of that force upstream on the Tugela River, and for reasons we'll discuss later, he will delegate the responsibility to Warren, the responsibility to break through the Boer lines, and that will result in Warren taking the decision to occupy the hill of Spioenkop. And next week, we're going to look at the continuance of the Boer advance and track the path to Spioenkop, and we'll finish that talk in the shadow of that famous hill.